You know that feeling when you're scrolling through endless online information and it all starts to feel, well, just like noise rather than clarity.
Yeah, like a swamp sometimes.
Exactly. That's what we're trying to cut through here at the Deep Dive.
Yeah.
Take the complexity and deliver the clarity tailored for you.
And today we're tackling something pretty significant. It's Meta's recently overhauled content policies. We've sifted through the announcements, the analysis.
Lots to sift through.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And the concerns raised by groups like the Human Rights Campaign, Amnesty International, and crucially, the initial assessment from the Meta Oversight Board. We want to bring you the essential understanding.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning. January 7th, 2025. That's the date Meta CEO Mark Zuckerberg announced this huge change.
A complete overhaul, really.
Yeah, we're talking about the end of fact-checking as we knew it. A much, much lighter touch on content moderation, focusing mainly on illegal stuff.
Right, the illegal content primarily.
And a significant rollback, maybe even dismantling, of their hateful conduct policy. And Meta's framing for all this.
Well, they're framing it as a defense of free speech. That's the banner they're flying.
Little speech.
But, what's really critical to look at are the potential consequences, especially for marginalized communities.
Right.
The Human Rights Campaign, for instance, they don't see this as just a straightforward win for expression. Not at all.
What are they saying?
Their big concern is that these changes could very well just open the floodgates to increased anti-LGBTQ plus abuse across Facebook, Instagram, Threads, all of Meta's platforms.
And it's not just a vague worry, is it? I saw the HRC highlighted some really specific things now allowed under the updated community standards.
They did, and they're deeply concerning.
I mean, things like
Yeah.
potentially allowing descriptions of LGBTQ plus individuals as mentally ill or abnormal. That just feels like a massive step backwards.
It really does. And you have to think about the context, right? We're already seeing intense debates, often negative rhetoric, around LGBTQ plus rights.
Sure.
So a policy shift like this on platforms with Meta's enormous reach, it has the power to normalize, even amplify some really harmful viewpoints.
Yeah, I see that.
And the HRC also pointed to allowing calls for exclusion, like saying LGBTQ plus people shouldn't be in the military or education or law enforcement.
Okay.
We're barring them from public spaces, advocating for gender-based exclusion in restrooms, sports, even schools, just based on sexual orientation or gender identity.
You can just picture how that kind of rhetoric, given such a huge platform, could cause real damage. And then there's the actual language Meta used in the policy itself, that term transgenderism. HRC flagged that immediately.
Absolutely. And that's crucial. Transgenderism isn't usually a neutral term.
Right.
It's often used in anti-trans circles to sort of delegitimize transgender identities, to frame being trans as like an ideology or a pathology rather than just who someone is.
So putting it in the policy isn't just semantics.
Exactly. It signals a potentially problematic way of thinking underlying the policy itself. The HRC argues pretty convincingly, I think, that these aren't just passive changes. They could actively legitimize, maybe even encourage discrimination.
Okay, so that's the shift in what content is allowed. There's also a huge change in how they handle misinformation, isn't there? Getting rid of fact-checkers.
Yeah, that's the other big piece. They're phasing out the third-party fact-checkers and putting their bets on user-generated community notes, kind of like what we see on X.
And how well has that worked out elsewhere?
Well, that's the worry, isn't it? Experience shows these systems can be, frankly, manipulated. Bad faith actors can weaponize them to push biased or just plain false narratives.
So for LGBTQ plus communities.
The specific danger is amplifying disinformation, right? Misgendering people, dead-naming them, maybe dressing it up with some pseudoscientific context, all under this banner of community accuracy. It's a real risk.
A risk of amplifying harmful stuff without a proper check. And then you add that to Meta saying they're reducing moderation overall, just focusing on illegal content. It sounds like they're basically saying, look, if it's not strictly illegal, even if it's hateful, abusive, awful, it might just stay up.
That is the core concern, yeah.
Yeah.
This could create an environment for what people call lawful but awful content.
Aren't all awful?
Speech that doesn't break the law, but it's still deeply offensive, hateful, harmful. And the likely result, a chilling effect on LGBTQ plus users. Meaning people might feel less safe. They might face constant negativity, harassment. So they might self-censor, pull back, maybe even leave the platforms entirely, which means fewer LGBTQ plus voices, less visibility.
And putting it all together, less moderation, plus a hateful conduct policy that now seems to explicitly allow certain anti-LGBTQ plus attacks.
It paints a really worrying picture.
It does.
The HRC even brought up that amazing Turn the Internet Red campaign back in 2013 for marriage equality. So much of that happened on Facebook.
Yeah, powerful example. It makes you wonder, could a movement like that even happen today under these new rules?
That's such an important point. It really highlights the huge role these platforms have played, for LGBTQ plus advocacy, community building, social change.
Definitely.
The fear now is that by normalizing misinformation and making harassment more intense, Meta is actually undermining the very spaces where these movements grew.
And it doesn't just stay online, does it?
No, that's critical. There's a real worry that normalizing hate online, the threats online, can spill over into actual physical violence. It's a serious threat to representation, equality, even democracy.
Okay, so let's bring in the Meta Oversight Board. There's supposed to be this independent check, right?
Right.
What's their take on all this?
Well, their reaction is very telling. They've explicitly called on Meta to really evaluate the negative human rights impacts of these new policies.
Evaluate the impact after making the changes.
Exactly. They specifically pointed out that Meta seems to have made these huge changes without any public sign that they did a human rights due diligence assessment beforehand.
Wow. That seems fundamental, especially for changes this big.
It does seem fundamental, yeah. The board raised specific concerns about how these policies could disproportionately harm vulnerable communities, and they explicitly named LGBTQ plus individuals, minors, and immigrants as being particularly at risk.
So they see the danger.
Yes. And they've also urged Meta to take a hard look at whether this new community note system actually works to combat misinformation. Is it effective?
So they're definitely not just rubber stamping Meta's decisions then.
No, not at all. It's interesting, actually. In some recent cases, the board agreed with Meta letting certain posts stay up, like about trans people in bathrooms or sports. They argued it was public debate and didn't hit the bar for inciting imminent violence.
Okay.
But they've also overturned Meta's decisions in other cases, removing racist content, anti-immigrant stuff, posts about the UK riots. In those cases, they felt the risk of harm escalating was too high, so they're focused on that imminent harm threshold.
So it's like a tricky balancing act. Free expression versus real harm.
Precisely. And the board didn't mince words about the process either. They basically said the January 7th changes felt rushed, announced suddenly, without the usual deliberation or transparency.
And without that human rights assessment again.
Right. So they've issued recommendations. They want Meta to urgently assess the human rights impact, especially on groups like LGBTQ plus people. They want better enforcement against bullying and harassment.
Makes sense.
They want clearer rules on what counts as hateful ideology now, and they want Meta to constantly check if community notes are actually working against misinformation or, making things worse.
So it definitely sounds like the Oversight Board has serious reservations. They're pushing back.
They are. They're urging Meta to really think about the consequences. But, the question remains whether Meta will listen or change course based on these non-binding recommendations.
A big question. Now, we also looked at other human rights groups, right? Amnesty International had some strong warnings, too.
They did. And their assessment is, frankly, stark. Deeply concerning. Amnesty argues that Meta's new policies actually risk fueling mass violence, even genocide.
Genocide. Wow. That's an incredibly strong charge.
It is, and they draw a direct, sobering parallel to the Rohingya crisis in Myanmar,
where Facebook was heavily implicated.
Demonstrably shown to have played a huge role in spreading hate speech that fueled the atrocities against the Rohingya people. Amnesty points to how Meta's algorithms often boost content that gets strong reactions, which unfortunately includes hate speech and lies because it drives engagement and ultimately profit.
So the fear is, by removing safeguards,
they're essentially taking the brakes off a dangerous system. Amnesty also mentioned a whistleblower complaint to the SEC, alleging Meta misled shareholders about its role in the Rohingya genocide, downplaying the risks. It suggests a pattern.
So this isn't just theoretical future risk, there's history here, serious history.
Exactly. And the report we looked at also uncovered some deeply troubling examples, allegedly from Meta's own internal training materials about what's okay now.
Like what?
Examples like, Black people are more violent than whites, or trans people are mentally ill, reportedly used as examples of speech that might now be permissible.
That's chilling, if those are the internal examples.
It really throws the potential harm into sharp relief, doesn't it? The argument some are making is that these policies, however Meta frames them and their likely impacts, they aren't just accidental oversights. They're not just sloppy.
Right. Okay, so let's try and bring this all together. We've got Meta explicitly allowing rhetoric that's deeply damaging, particularly to the LGBTQ plus community.
Yes.
The new system for misinformation, community notes, is viewed with a lot of skepticism, maybe easily manipulated.
Big concerns there.
Content moderation is being scaled back, raising the prospect of just more harmful stuff circulating freely. And crucially, the Meta Oversight Board itself, plus major human rights groups like HRC and Amnesty, are sounding really loud alarm bells about the human rights implications.
That's a very good summary. The fundamental worry is that all these shifts combined will create a significantly more hostile, unsafe online world for LGBTQ plus people and other vulnerable groups. The permission for harmful rhetoric, the risks with community notes, less moderation, it all points in a deeply worrying direction.
It really makes you stop and think, doesn't it, about the role social media has played in movements for equality and justice.
Huge role, historically.
If those same platforms become places where marginalized voices are threatened, silenced, attacked, what does that mean for future advocacy, for community building, for just societal progress? It feels like we really have to grapple with the immense responsibility these huge companies have in shaping not just online talk, but the real world.
Absolutely. As we discussed, these platforms are incredibly powerful tools. They can be used for immense good, but also potentially for immense harm. The critical question now is, what happens when those tools increasingly become spaces where hate and lies can just run rampant? It's a challenge that needs constant scrutiny, critical thinking from all of us, and a serious look at the ethics of these.